Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we dive deep into some pretty complicated stories,
Mhm.
uncovering all those layers that sometimes get missed. Like today, we're looking into Michael Hagelin.
Ah, yeah, Michael Hagelin. He committed two murders, first his mother and then later his girlfriend.
Yeah, two murders. It's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And it brings up a lot of questions, not just about, like, the nature of evil, but also, like, how much childhood trauma plays a role. Can people like this be rehabilitated? And look, where's the line between justice and mercy?
Yeah, for sure. Big questions.
So to really understand this case, I think we have to start at the very beginning. Michael's childhood was it was really tough. Abandoned by his father very early on, he was raised by just his mom, Christina, and she had her own struggles, both physical and mental health issues, it sounds like.
Right. And what's really disturbing in this case is how much abuse Michael went through. I mean, it wasn't just neglect. Reports say it was straight up emotional and verbal abuse. Christina would constantly put him down, like telling him he was a mistake and she wished she never had him. And that, I mean, that kind of constant emotional abuse can really mess a kid up. It shapes how they see themselves and their ability to have healthy relationships.
It's hard to imagine growing up in that kind of environment. On top of all that, there are even allegations of possible sexual abuse by Christina.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, if that's true, it just adds another layer of trauma to an already awful upbringing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, each type of abuse can have its own impact. Like with emotional abuse, you often see people with damaged self-esteem. They have trouble trusting people and forming close relationships. And with sexual abuse, there can be feelings of shame and guilt and difficulty with healthy sexual boundaries. And when a kid experiences both at the same time, the effects can be even
It's
worse.
a lot to deal with.
It is.
But even with all that going on, Michael still did really well in school. Teachers described him as a quiet, well-behaved student, like such a contrast to what was happening at home, almost like he was living in two totally separate worlds.
Right, that's where that whole nature versus nurture thing comes into play. Like, were there parts of Michael's personality that maybe already made him more likely to be violent? Or was it all because of the trauma?
It's a really complicated question. I mean, basically what it comes down to is how much of who we are is determined by our genes, like our nature, and how much is influenced by how we were raised and the environment we grew up in. The nurture part.
That's a really interesting question, especially in Michael's case. So, like, could his genes have made him more prone to violence? Or was it the environment he was in that led to his actions? Probably a bit of both. We
Yeah.
can't ignore the possibility of genetic factors. But the severity and how often the abuse happened, I mean, that definitely had a huge impact on Michael psychologically. A lot of research shows a link between childhood trauma and mental health problems, like personality disorders, for example. People with those often struggle with things like controlling their emotions. They can be impulsive. They take a lot of risks.
So we can't say for sure about his genes, but it sounds like the trauma created a breeding ground for any pre-existing issues to really take hold.
Exactly. It's kind of like imagine a seed that could grow into a poisonous plant. If you plant it in rich soil
Hmm.
and, keep it in the dark and don't really care for it, well, it's more likely to grow and thrive,
Yeah.
right? In Michael's case, the abuse he went through, it was like that fertile soil.
Wow, that's a powerful image. So let's move on to Michael's teenage years. He enrolls in culinary school. Seems like a positive step toward a better future. He even starts dating. But that unfortunately seemed to trigger his mother's possessiveness and need for control.
Yeah, that's a key moment. It shows what was already going on in their relationship. Christina, I mean, she couldn't deal with her own emotional baggage, so she tried to keep Michael under her thumb. She didn't want him to be independent or form any healthy bonds with other people.
It's almost like any attempt by Michael to break free, have his own life, was seen as a threat to her control. And this is what eventually leads to a really tragic confrontation.
So it's October 30th, 2000. Michael, he's 17 at this point, goes to see his mom after his grandmother convinces him to. Seems like a normal visit, but it quickly turns into a huge argument.
And it wasn't just your typical teenage rebellion, right? I mean, Christina really didn't like Michael's girlfriend at all. She saw her as a threat. Like, this girl was trying to take away her control over her son.
Yeah, spot on. It was this battle between Michael wanting his own life and his mom's desperate need to control him. And it ends terribly. Michael just snaps. All those years of rage and resentment come pouring out, and he grabs a knife. He stabs Christina over and over, like over 40 times, focusing on her neck and heart.
It's brutal. It really speaks to how much anger he had inside, how damaged he was psychologically. And then his behavior afterward, it's just as disturbing. He tries to block his mom's bedroom door, washes up, takes money from her purse, and then just leaves. Spends hours at a library, completely detached from what he just did.
Right. It's like classic dissociation, a defense mechanism where your mind basically checks out of reality because it can't handle the trauma. It's like his mind couldn't process what he had done, so he separated himself from it emotionally.
It's a crazy reminder of just how resilient the human mind can be,
Mm.
but also how dark it can get. And to add to it, all the autopsy reveals that Christina had a cavity in her brain, which could explain why she acted so erratically and why she abused Michael.
Right, which brings up that nature versus nurture question again. Did this physical thing in her brain contribute to her abuse? And did that in turn affect Michael's violent behavior? We can't say for sure if there's a direct link, but it does make you wonder if biological factors played a role in their family dynamics.
It's really sad. It's like sometimes victims of abuse end up becoming abusers themselves, and the cycle just continues. So despite the court acknowledging how terribly Michael was abused, they still decide his crime is just too awful. He gets sentenced to closed youth care for 2.5 years.
And that brings up another issue, how we deal with young offenders. Should we just punish them? Or should we try to rehabilitate them, help them deal with the underlying trauma that might have led them to commit the crime? In Michael's case, I wonder if earlier intervention, like therapy or counseling, could have helped him manage his anger and prevented this whole tragedy.
It's a question that hangs over the whole case. No easy answer. So he's released in July of 2003, graduates from culinary school, looks like he's trying to build a new life. Starts a new relationship, too. It seemed hopeful, like maybe he was healing.
But the damage was already done. He was really jealous and possessive. Big mood swings, the relationship eventually ends. But these behaviors, they often point to unresolved trauma. People who've been abused as kids, they struggle with things like controlling their emotions, intimacy, and trust. So forming healthy relationships is incredibly hard.
It's like the abuse created this pattern for how he interacted with people. It distorted his view of love and relationships. And then in the spring of 2005, when Michael's 21, he meets Sandra. She had just come out of a tough relationship herself.
Sandra was looking for comfort and stability, and Michael seemed kind and vulnerable. He told her about his past, but both Sandra and her family, they saw him as a victim, someone who had been through a lot but was ultimately a good person. They thought he could turn things around, even offered him a place to stay, and tried to make him feel like he belonged.
That shows a lot of compassion on their part. But it's also a reminder of how easy it is to miss those warning signs, to let empathy blind you to the truth. I mean, Michael had a history of violence, trouble controlling his emotions. That should have been a red flag. But unfortunately, their trust was misplaced.
Yeah, and as the relationship gets more serious, those possessive and controlling behaviors start coming back. He gets even more jealous and suspicious, angry outbursts. And what's even more concerning is he starts seeing similarities between Sandra and his mother. It's like he can't separate his past trauma from his present life.
It's a dangerous pattern for sure, one that sets the stage for history to repeat itself. Then one night after drinking, Michael loses it. He forces Sandra onto the floor, surrounds her with knives, and threatens to kill her.
It's like a flashback to his past. Clearly, he was still fighting the same demons. The cycle of abuse was starting all over again. That incident was a huge missed opportunity to step in, recognize the danger, and get him help before it was too late.
It's so sad to see it happening again. Even with all the warning signs, the cycle just keeps going. Michael apologizes for that night with the knives, says he blacked out from the alcohol. And Sandra, she wants to believe him, that he can change. So she forgives him.
Yeah, that's something you see a lot in these kinds of relationships. The abuser downplays what they did. They blame it on something else, like in this case, the alcohol, or maybe even say it was Sandra's fault somehow. And the victim, they're stuck. They want to believe things will get better, that he really means it when he says he's sorry.
And unfortunately for Sandra, she was wrong to trust him. They visit Sandra's family, and Michael gets fixated on something he sees. Sandra talking with a guy who was there. It was nothing really, but Michael's jealousy just explodes. They argue on the way home, and it doesn't stop when they get back to the apartment.
That's where his warped thinking and that inability to control his emotions become really dangerous. Instead of talking about how he feels, in a healthy way, he lets the jealousy eat away at him. He twists things around in his mind and turns it into this confirmation of his worst fear, that Sandra, just like his mother, is going to leave him.
And it all leads up to this horrific act. Sandra thinks the fight is over, but Michael, he's got something else in mind. He goes and gets a knife from the kitchen, hides it, then comes back to Sandra and offers to give her a massage. It's scary. He's setting her up, making her feel safe so she'll let her guard down.
The fact that he planned it out ahead of time is really disturbing. This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment thing, losing his temper. It was cold and calculated, and that kind of premeditation, it fits with some of the characteristics you see in antisocial personality disorder. People with that condition often have no regard for social norms or rules. They lack empathy,
Yeah.
and they can be very manipulative and deceitful.
And Sandra had no idea what he was planning. So she says yes to the massage. She's lying there, totally relaxed and vulnerable, and then he goes for it. Leaves the room, grabs a pot, comes back and starts hitting her with it over and over, and then he stabs her with the knife he had hidden.
And during the attack, something awful happens. Michael sees his mother's face, hears her voice. His past trauma is completely mixed up with what's happening right now. It's like he isn't even attacking Sandra anymore. It's like he's getting revenge on his mother. He's seeing both women at the same time.
It just shows you the power of unresolved trauma, how past experiences can totally distort the way someone sees the world and make them do unimaginable things. Just like with his first murder, Michael hides Sandra's body, wraps her up in a rug, cleans the entire apartment, then takes off, leaving behind this horrific scene.
Yeah, and the way he does it again, the cleaning, the fact that he's so detached from what he's done, it points to a serious personality disorder. He
Yeah.
shows no remorse. It's like he doesn't understand the consequences of his actions at all. Like,
Yeah.
there's this total inability to see things from Sandra's point of view, to feel any empathy for her.
Of course, people at Sandra's work and her family start to worry when she doesn't show up. Her parents go to her apartment and, well, they find her. The people who welcomed Michael into their home, who believed in him, now have to face the awful truth. Sandra, their daughter, who they loved so much, is gone, and the man they tried to help is the one who took her from them.
It's a terrible tragedy, and it affects so many people. Sandra's family, their friends, the whole community. The trust they had in Michael is gone, replaced by fear and anger and this overwhelming sense of loss.
The police catch Michael at a roadblock. He doesn't even try to run. He confesses right away, describing everything he did in this really matter-of-fact way, almost like he's talking about something that happened to someone else. The psychological evaluations they did on him confirm what everyone was thinking. He has a severe personality disorder with antisocial and psychopathic traits.
And this is where we bump up against some of the toughest questions in our justice system. How do we balance the need to hold people accountable for their crimes with the fact that mental illness is real? Is it even possible to rehabilitate someone with such a severe personality disorder? Or are they too dangerous to ever be allowed back into society?
Those are questions that we still struggle with as a society, questions with no simple answers. At his trial, Michael shows absolutely no remorse. He even falls asleep sometimes while it's going on. And then he says this chilling thing, talking about the murders. He says, "Now I know how to do it." That really sealed the court's view of him. This is a dangerous person who can't feel empathy for other people.
Yeah, that lack of remorse, that almost practical way of looking at what he did, really highlights the complexity of these disorders. It makes us question our usual ideas about guilt and responsibility. How much can we hold someone accountable when their brain works this way?
In the end, Michael is sentenced to life in prison. Higher courts upheld the ruling, and he ends up right back where he started, locked up. His whole life now defined by these two horrible acts.
But the story doesn't really end there, does it? It leaves us with so many questions. Could things have been different if someone had intervened earlier? Is there any hope for people with these disorders? How do we balance the need for justice with the fact that mental illness plays such a big role in some of these cases?
These are questions we need to keep asking, keep thinking about, because ultimately understanding what drives people like Michael isn't about pointing fingers. It's about stopping this from happening again. It's about breaking the cycle of violence and building a world that's safer and more compassionate. That's what we need to take away from this deep dive.